Today on our 2018 Jeep Wrangler JL Unlimited, we're going to be taking a look at the Roadmaster InvisiBrake supplemental braking system, part number RM-8700. And to help us with our installation, we're going to be using the Roadmaster stoplight switch kit, part number RM-751490, and the Tekonsha custom wiring adapter for trailer brake controllers for Ford chassis, part number 3034-S. Whenever we're flat towing our Jeep, we don't want to only rely on our motorhome's brakes, because not only does it have to slow itself down, but it also is going to have to slow our Jeep down. Well, that's where our InvisiBrake is going to help out. It's going to take some of that stress off of our motorhome and allow our Jeep to slow itself down without having to worry about pushing our motorhome down the road. The nice thing about our InvisiBrake is that it's going to be a one-time permanent installation. We're not going to have to worry about taking something in and out and trying to set it up every time we want to tow our Jeep. For the most part, our InvisiBrake is going to be pretty well hidden. We're only going to see that small clamp going around the brake pedal arm, and that's what's actually going to apply the brakes. It's going to have a cable attached to it that's going to pull that brake pedal, allowing our Jeep to slow down. We're going to be able to adjust the braking force by turning this knob, turning it clockwise to increase the braking force, or turning it counterclockwise to decrease it, depending on our driving habits and the size of our motorhome. Being able to know what's going on inside of our Jeep while we're driving is priceless. So that's why Roadmaster has included that indicator light, and that light's going to come on whenever our InvisiBrake is applying the brakes to our car. So if I step on the brakes in our motorhome, the light's going to come on, letting us know that they're being applied, so we know that they're actually working properly. Now, also built into it is a safety feature. If we're on the brakes for too long or just for an extended period of time, it will release the brakes. For instance, if we're at a stoplight, we don't need that constant pressure applying the brakes on our Jeep, so after a little while, the brakes will release. My foot's still on the brake, but they released. Now there's another safety feature built in as well. If something were to happen to where the brakes were to stay applied for too long, for instance, if something fell on the brake pedal in our Jeep, or if it wasn't adjusted properly to where they wouldn't release, not only would the lights stay on, but we'd have an audible alert letting us know that the brakes are constantly being applied. Now, our InvisiBrake is going to include a couple wires so that we can connect everything to that monitor light. One end of the Jeep side is going to hook up to our stoplight switch so we can get the brake signal, and then we're going to have a patch cord that's going to go in between our Jeep and then over to our motorhome. Now, we chose to run ours and route ours a little bit differently, since chances are a lot of people are going to end up losing this wire since it's so small and we don't have anything to protect it from any kind of corrosion. So we wired ours directly into our 6-way, so then we just ran it through the umbilical and it went to our 7-way, and we wired it up so we're using the brake output signal. Normally that's used for a brake controller, but in our application we didn't have one, so we tapped into that signal, and then up at the dash we found the corresponding wire and wired up our light. That way it's a lot more permanent. We don't have to worry about having that patch cord either go missing or any kind of corrosion. We're going to need our umbilical for our lighting anyway, so it's going to make life a lot simpler. Our InvisiBrake is going to include a breakaway switch. And what that means is, in the case of an accidental disconnection from our motorhome, this pin would be pulled and it's going to apply the brakes at full force. So now that we've seen our InvisiBrake and seen how it works, let's show you how we routed everything. So I went ahead and left my InvisiBrake loose so I could show you all the connections. On the back side of our control box, we're going to have two plugs. One that's going to have a 4-pole wiring, one that's going to have a red and black wire, and then a black cable. And then we're going to take a 1/4-inch air line, plug it into the back of it, and then plug in this 1/4-inch plastic air line into it. Then we'll have a very small 1/8-inch air line that'll go into the back of the controller. Now all of these wires and hoses I ran underneath the carpet, underneath the seat where I'm going to be mounting my control box itself. So I just tucked the wires under the carpet and ran them into the front seat. Now we're also going to have an actuator that I chose to mount right here, and that's where that 1/8-inch air line is going to go to. And the cable that's attached to our actuator is going up front as well. So all my wires ran underneath my seat. Then I loosened the panel over here on the threshold, and I ran my wires under the carpet here along the side, and most of them, except that 1/8 inch air line, went out through the firewall. Now again, that 1/8 inch air line is going to that actuator, and then the cable I routed again under the carpet, and it ran up to this cable here that's attached to this pulley. Now this cable is what's going to activate our brakes. It's going to pull, which will apply the brakes by pulling on the brake pedal. It's very important that we mount this pulley horizontally, and that the section of cable here that goes to this clamp over here on the left hand side is as straight as we can get it, and that that cable is centered in the pulley, so that whenever it pulls that pedal down, that cable will be nice and straight. So it may be off a little bit now, but once it starts pulling, it's going to pull it directly straight. And basically, we're just going to have 2 nuts that are going to clamp on to this clamp here. And it's just an L-shaped clamp that goes around the brake pedal, and we cut the excess off so it won't interfere with our feet when we're driving. To make sure you have the right adjustment on your brake pedal, you just want a little bit of play in that cable so that it's not constantly pulling on the brake pedal. Just want just a little bit of play to where that ball is sticking out at the very end. And if you adjust the 2 nuts on the clamp itself, it'll give you a 1/2 inch of play either way. So you just loosen one up and adjust it to however you see fit. And once you come past the clamp, you're going to want to have as gentle of a curve as you can. That's why I routed it over and then made an S curve going back to the cylinder. And then the rest of the wires I ran up, and there's a grommet that's all the way to the left hand side that we passed it through. And all of our wires came out of the firewall in the engine bay just to the outside of our brake booster. I just went ahead and drilled a hole and cut a slit, put my grommet back in place, and then put some silicone around it to seal it up. And we can start with our red and black wire. We ran that along the firewall towards the battery on the passenger side. I went around my fuse box and I took my black wire, put a ring terminal on, and I tapped into this existing ground right here on the outside passenger side fender here. And then my red wire, I routed it over towards the battery. I put a fuse holder in place, and then I tapped directly into the positive post on the battery with another ring terminal. That's what's going to be supplying our InvisiBrake with power and making sure that it's going to be protected, we don't have any issues. They do provide us with that fuse holder and a 20 amp fuse. Now the 4-pole wiring that we have here, this we had to come out, and then we actually dropped it down right here to meet up with the existing tow bar wiring, because this is going to tie into that. And basically all we're going to do is tie into that tow bar wiring color for color. So green will go to green, yellow to yellow, and so forth. The only difference is that we need to make sure that we have a separate ground for our white wire other than our existing ground for the 4-pole wiring. Now that 1/4 inch vacuum hose, we ran it up, and this is going to be tying into the vacuum system on our vehicle. Because if you've ever tried to press on a brake pedal when the car is off, you'll know that it starts to get really stiff and it's harder and harder to press on it. So that's why our InvisiBrake is going to tap into the vacuum system so it has enough pressure to be able to apply the brakes. So if we find the line that goes directly to our brake booster here, I just followed it down, I went past this check valve, and I made a small cut, took some of the vacuum hose they provide in our kit, and I put a T in place. Now on either side of the T, you just want to have a little bit of that vacuum hose, and then towards the engine, I put a check valve. Now you'll notice there's a slight bit of red there. You want to make sure that the red section is going towards the engine, and there's a small arrow that'll be pointing towards the engine as well. And then we can take a little bit more vacuum hose, put it on the end of our check valve, and then connect the other side of our vacuum line going to the engine to it. And then finally on that T, we're going to take another section of that 1/4 inch vacuum hose, put it on the small end, and then we'll insert the vacuum tube directly into it. So now there was one more wire coming out of there, and that was that black cable. That black cable is going to go up towards the front where we mounted our breakaway switch. So we just followed our 4-pole wiring down in the same direction, and we routed it underneath going towards the front of our vehicle. Now, you just want to be extremely careful because we have a lot of moving parts up here and a lot of heat sources since we have the engine, the steering column, all the suspension. So you just want to be extra careful while you're routing your wires. And then we routed that wire down and up to the front. And we mounted our breakaway switch right here underneath the bumper. We did have to cut out a section of our skid plate here, and then we used a short bracket to mount it directly to the base plate. And the back of the breakaway switch is just going to have a connector on it that matches up to the one on that black wire. You just connect them together, and I always suggest putting a little bit of electrical tape on it to make sure it stays secure, keeps all that moisture and debris out of it as well. Now we do have one last connection to make, and that's going to be for our monitor wire. We do get a lot of questions of how exactly to hook it up, so we'll go into a little bit more detail and show you exactly how we're going to wire it up. So since we don't need our carpet or the panels pulled up to put our monitor wire in, we'll go ahead and put this back. Now one thing I do want to mention is that when we put our carpet back in place, you're going to need to cut a section out so that our pulley is going to be exposed so it's not rubbing on the carpet. And not just the pulley, we want to make sure that the cable is exposed as well. If we cut right below this mounting point here, we should have plenty of room for our cable and our pulley. And then we can just start working our carpet back into position. We're going to put all our panels back. Make sure our cylinder, hoses, and cables aren't going to interfere with anything. To put our monitor wire in place, we're going to need to put in that stoplight switch. Now, it should just pop out, but if you're having a little bit of trouble, you can take a plastic trim panel tool, and you're just going to go along the edge here, and you're going to pull this panel directly out. There's just clips holding it in place, so we're going to work our way around, unclipping them. And we can set this aside. With that panel removed, if we find the steering column here and we look just to the left of it, there's going to be a bolt that we're going to have to remove. We want to grab a 13mm socket and coming from the bottom, just kind of feed it up. Usually helps to use a long extension. And then we're going to remove the nut that's right there. So we can grab our bracket and the stoplight switch. Now the switch is going to have 2 nuts and a star washer on it. We're going to want to remove that outer nut as well as the star washer. And on the bracket, it's going to be extremely hard to see, but one hole is just slightly bigger. And if you try to put the stoplight switch in, it won't fit. So we're going to use a larger one where it should just slide in pretty easily. And for now, we're just going to kind of adjust this nut so it sits about halfway, and then loosely put the star washer and the other nut in place. We don't want it super tight right now, we just want it tight enough that it's not going to be moving around too much on us. And then we're going to take our bracket and we're going to slide it over that stud and secure it with the nut that we removed. Just get it on there hand tight for now. And you can see that our switch is going to hit this plate here that's connected to the brake arm. So we can hold our switch in position, make sure it's lined up properly, and we'll tighten down that nut. With our bracket and stoplight loosely in place, we're going to start making our electrical connections. Now on the back, we're going to have 2 black wires. We're going to need to strip back the ends of each one. One of them, we're going to take one of our wires that comes from our InvisiBrake kit, and one end's going to have this connector on it, and the other end is just going to be a bare wire. We're going to strip back the bare end and use a butt connector to connect it to one of the wires on our switch. Now it doesn't matter which wire we go to, you just want to make sure that you have a good connection and then you get your butt connector all the way on. With our one wire connected, on the other wire we're going to take the included red wire in our kit. We're going to strip back one end and crimp on another butt connector and connect it to the other wire switch. Easier to come through this hole here to connect it, but just make sure to route the wire back down through the back side so we don't have that wire sticking out the front. So I'm going to route our wire through the back side. Now both the red wire and our monitor light wire is going to have to go into the engine bay. So we'll use the same grommet that we used for all of our other wiring, just to the left-hand side over by the firewall. Once we have most of our wire pushed through, or a little bit, we'll move into the engine bay and pull all the excess out. Now you want to be careful not to pull too tight, and it's not a bad idea to go inside and double check and make sure the wires didn't get hung up on anything. We're going to start with our red wire, and this is going to be the one supplying power to our switch. So we're just going to route it along the same way towards the passenger side where our battery and fuse holders are in place. Let's go behind these brackets and go towards the passenger side. So we routed our wire over towards our fuse box and our battery on the passenger side. Now if we lift up and push on these two tabs on the fuse box, we can remove the cover. Now the way we normally would supply power to our brake switch would be through a fuse tab. But if you can see, our fuse tab is made for a mini fuse where our Jeep doesn't have those, so it wouldn't even fit in the spot to put in. So instead, we're going to be using a fuse holder as well as the provided 10 amp fuse that comes in our kit, and we're going to be going directly to the battery. So that way it's still fuse protected and we can get everything in line. So we're going to strip back the end of the wire that we ran from the inside. We're going to take a butt connector and crimp it on. Then we can take our fuse holder, and each end's just going to have a little bit of insulation that's already stripped back. So we'll take it off and we'll slide it in to our butt connector and crimp it in place. So now we can just kind of loosely route our wire to make sure we're going to have enough room. We can lift up the cover on our battery, and we're going to be going right to the positive post. So we're going to need to grab a 13mm socket and remove the nut. So we'll loosen that nut up, but we're going to need to put a ring terminal in place before we can put our wire on. So we'll slide our ring terminal over and crimp it in place. Now, the ring terminal does not come with the kit. We can remove the nut. If there's any other terminals on the battery, you want to make sure to put those back before we put the nut back in place. And with our connections made, we can take our 10 amp fuse, slide it into the fuse holder, then we just take a couple zip ties and secure our wires and make sure they're not loose underneath the engine here. Our black wire, we're going to run down the same way we ran our 4-pole wiring, and we're going to route this black wire up to the front by our electrical connector. Again, you just want to be careful because there's a lot of heat sources and moving parts up here. So you just want to make sure that once you route it, you secure it with a bunch of zip ties, making sure it's not going to get damaged. So I routed that wire up to where my electrical connector is. Now we got a couple different options of what we can do here. We can tie up the excess behind our skid plate to where you're only going to have a little bit of that connector sticking out. And then you would take the patch cord and it would plug into the connector, and the other end would go into the motorhome side. However, we're going to wire ours directly into our 6-way connector. That way it's a little bit more permanent, and we don't have to worry about any kind of moisture or corrosion or anything happening to our wire, not to mention we don't have to worry about losing our patch cord. So we'll just take our connector off, and ours is held on by two 5/16 self-tapping screws. So we'll pull those out. You're going to want a little bit of room, so we'll pull our connector out just a bit. We're going to pull the dust cover off. And we're not going to need all of this wire, so we're just going to give ourselves more than we need, but just enough to work with. And we'll cut our wire And then we're going to take the end of it, pass it through our dust cover. And once we have it through, pull the excess out, slide the dust cover back. Now we're going to be wiring ours into the brake signal. That way, whenever the brakes are pressed, it'll send a signal to our 6-way and then to our motorhome. Strip back the end of our wire. Then we can take a small screwdriver. We're going to need to find the terminal that's labeled S on the back of here. So we'll loosen it up. Then we can take our wire, put it into the terminal. Now you just want to leave a little bit of that copper out the very top because you don't want the insulation to get stuck in there and cause kind of some connection issues. We can push the excess wire out the back. Then we can put our dust cover back on. Now I do suggest that you tie up any excess wires behind the skid plate. We don't have to worry about them. To make sure we're not going to get any kind of moisture or anything else inside of our connector, I'm just going to take a little bit of silicone. I'm going to fill up the back hole here where all the wires are going in. So we have a nice secure connection point. We don't have to worry about any kind of corrosion building up. And then on the front end, I'm just going to take some tape, wrap it around until we get back towards that silicone. Push our wires back in place, line up the connector, and replace those 2 screws that were holding it in. With our wires ran and our connections made, we're needing to make the final adjustment on our brake switch itself. Now the way we're going to do that is we're going to loosen or tighten the 2 nuts to either draw it in further, closer to the brake pedal arm, which will push that plunger in, or we'll pull it away to let the plunger stick out some. Now essentially we want to adjust it to where we have just barely any bit of travel on the pedal before it comes on. So we're going to get it adjusted using a 14 and a 17mm wrench for the 2 nuts. And the way you're going to know you have it adjusted correctly is the wire that's going to the front for our monitor wire. We're going to want to hook a tester up to that, and when we just barely push on the pedal, we want to get that signal letting us know that it has power. So about an 1/8 inch of travel is what we're looking for. I'm just going to loosen everything up so I can get my switch started in the right position. You're just looking for a little bit of that plunger to stick out. We'll do a real loose adjustment by hand, and then we'll come back with those 2 wrenches and tighten everything up. So once we have it adjusted and everything snugged up, we're going to need to take a circuit tester and make sure that our indicator light is going to come on when we just barely push on the brake pedal. So since we have it hooked up to our 6-way up here, I'm going to take my circuit tester and go to the appropriate pin, which if we're looking at it, will be towards the top, towards the passenger side. If I get an extra set of hands, just barely push on the brake pedal, we can see that my test light's coming on, so we are getting power. And that's how we're going to know that we have it adjusted properly. Now if you need to readjust it, again, you just want to adjust it a little bit and then have somebody push on it while you're testing this wire here so you can make sure that you have the proper amount of travel. You're just looking for about an 1/8 inch, just normally how when you push on the brake pedal you'll hear that click to release it so you can put it into gear. That's about the same amount we want to be able to push and have power coming to the front here. So with all of our connections made, we can line our panels back up and put everything back in place. To make sure that our actuator is secure, I'm going to take the included hose clamp that comes in our kit and a self-tapping screw. I'm going to go through the eyelet. I'm just going to secure it directly to the floor. I'm going to take another couple self-tapping screws and go into each side of our control box so that won't move around either. With the install complete on our Jeep side, we can move over to the motorhome and install the monitor light. Now in our motorhome, we're towing our Jeep using an E450. And the nice thing about that is that it has a tow package already, and we don't currently have a brake controller in here, so that's why we tied into that brake output wire on the front of our Jeep. So we just need to find a spot to mount our monitor light that's going to be visible but not in the way of everyday driving. Now we want to mount our monitor light just to the right of the ignition here, right here on this flat spot on our dash. That way it'll be visible, we just glance over and see it, but at the same time it's not going to be blinding us when we're driving at night. So the easiest way to access this point right here is if we come to this lower piece of the dash, it's just held in by some clips. So we're just going to pull it away. Now you just want to be careful if you have any other accessories mounted there, and our OBD2 port is mounted there as well, so you want to be careful when you're pulling it down. Now the upper piece of the dash as well is just held in by some clips, so we're just going to gently pull away. Now we just need enough room that we can get behind there with our hand. So we can find a nice spot on our dash. We're going to figure out a general spot, reach behind there, make sure there's nothing that's going to interfere, no electrical things, because we're going to have to drill a hole. Now the instructions tell you to drill a 5/16 hole, but in my experience, if you go one size smaller with a 19/64 drill bit, it'll be just enough and it'll give it a nice snug fit. So we'll find the spot on our dash that we want to drill for our light, and we'll drill our hole. Now again, you just want to make sure that once you have everything back in place, you have room for everything to come through. So we got plenty of room, at least a few inches right here. So I'm going to take my indicator light and we're going to pass our wires through. But before I do, just so it's a little bit easier to see, we're going to have this little speed nut, and from the back side, we're going to slide our wires through, and this is going to slide onto the indicator light behind the dash, and we're going to press it in, and that's what's going to keep the tension on it and keep it from pulling back out. It's got these two little tabs, and basically you just want that speed nut to go right over them and sandwich everything in between the dash there. So we can take our indicator light, putting the wires through first, we'll push them in, and then work our light until it's nice and flush against the dash. And we're going to reach behind the dash panel and put that speed nut in place. So you're going to want to find your wires, make sure that your wires go through the speed nut, and then run it all the way up through the wires, going around the indicator light, push it firmly against the back of the dash so it'll hold it in place. Now Roadmaster does provide you with a sticker as well to let you know what the indicator light is. Now you don't have to put this on, but we can just peel the backing paper off, then pop out the center section of the sticker. You're going to want to work it around the light. It is going to be a snug fit, but I just like to kind of put it around the light and then start turning it back and forth until we can get it to sit flush against the dash. And we can just press it in place. So I can barely just reach my wires to the outside of the dash here. And we're going to have a red wire and a white wire. And we're also going to have an audible alert that'll have a red and white wire on it as well. So we're just going to pull the insulation off the end of the wires. And to get everything hooked up, we're going to tie our two white wires together and put a butt connector in place. And we're going to do the same thing, tying the two red wires together with another one of our yellow butt connectors from our brake controller adapter kit. Now up until this point is going to be the same whether you have the tow package or not. Now if you're driving a different RV that doesn't have the tow package or it's not a Ford, that's okay, because we already tied into our Jeep on the brake output side of the plug on the front. So we'd open up the 7-way on the back of our RV, tie into the brake output signal there, and we would run the length of wire up into the cab here, and we would attach that wire to the two red wires we just connected. And then the white wire for our light and our alert would go to a ground. Since we're going to be using the factory tow package, we have the brake controller port And we're going to be working with the blue and white wire, which is going to be our brake output and our ground. So I'm going to strip a little bit more off the end of each one of these wires. That way the butt connectors have a good section to grab onto. And our white wire is going to connect to the two white wires that we put together with the butt connector. So you just want to make sure you grab the correct wire. So we'll put our wire into the butt connector and crimp it down. And then our blue wire is going to be going into the butt connector with the two red wires that we connected. Make sure we have those crimped down well. Now our black and our red wire are not going to be getting used. Now I don't like the idea of just leaving these bare in the back here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut just a little bit off. And then to make sure that nothing gets inside and damages the wires or causes any kind of shorts, I'm going to take another one of my butt connectors from the kit. I'm just going to slide it over the wire. We don't need to strip it back because we're not making any actual connections. It's going to act like a cap. And we'll do that for our red wire as well. Now with our connections made under here, we're going to take our brake controller plug and we're going to route it underneath the bottom of that lower piece of dash here. And then we can put our panel back in place. So make sure that upper panel piece is clipped back into place. Then we'll watch your wires around the clips themselves down here. Then we can put our lower panel back in as well. So we should have our brake controller wire coming out right at the bottom below that panel. Now we're going to need to find the plug that's matching our brake controller harness. So if we come to our brake pedal and go directly up, we should have a gray plug that's going to match it. Now, all we simply need to do is just plug it in, make sure it locks into place, and we just tie up our excess wires here so they're not going to be dangling down by our pedals. Just find some existing wiring, take a couple zip ties, pull it all out of the way. So now that we have everything done, we're ready to hook our Jeep up and start our adventure. And that'll finish up your look at the Roadmaster InvisiBrake supplemental braking system, part number RM-8700 on our 2018 Jeep Wrangler JL Unlimited.